Good evening. Can you hear me in the yes? Now. Okay. Let me make a couple of announcements. First, this is live. Second, there are people watching this and also in other rooms. So whenever you come for the questions at the end, please use your microphones, or the microphones will be provided. And let's keep the questions very short because we want the answers to be very long. It is the case that there are disruptions on a daily basis, but there are disruptions that are much more profound than others, and there are very few disruptions that are led by a person. I believe that Lee Hood is a disruptor, and I believe that medicine in general is going to be completely disrupted. And you are going to hear from the man who is going to disrupt it. It is not the case that on a daily basis you're going to hear a person who's going to tell you that the future of medicine is going to be totally different, and because of what he has done and because of what he is doing. In higher education, for instance, we say that disruption is happening because of technology, because of what's happening with the online education. As a matter of fact, this is a technological disruption. But here you are going to witness a very different type of disruption, a scientific disruption that is going to change, as I said earlier, medicine. Lee has a very serious aspect, but he also has a whimsical aspect. And I got to know him in Seattle briefly. And as you know, he and I came from Hollywood. That's not totally true. Came from Los Angeles. He was in Pasadena at Caltech. But once you're in Southern California, you're dominated by the entertainment industry. So Lee wanted, and I wanted, to provide you with some entertainment before we start. Please watch what we have done. How am I going to be in two places at the same time?
Mr. President, Lee Hood is on line 1.
Hi, Lee. This is Joseph.
Hi, Joseph. I want to go over some ideas for my lecture.
Sure, go ahead.
I could talk on the biotech industry, or the healthcare reform, or DNA cloning.
Wait, Lee. What did you say?
You know my work on DNA mapping and DNA cloning.
Cloning sounds great, Lee. I'm looking forward to your lecture.
Great. I'll see you on November 5th.
That's the answer. The solution is DNA cloning. Lee's work will do it for me. Pause. Let's do it again. Maggie?
Yes. The minister.
No, that won't do. No, I don't need the future president of the country. I need the president of Northeastern. I think I know exactly what needs to be done. Halfway there. Very clever. Whoa, larger than life. I need Lee. Lee, we all need you, and we are delighted to have you with us.
The grand challenge in biology is complexity. So I'd like to talk about how I've used innovation through paradigm changes to lead to the emergence of a new type of medicine that I call P4 medicine. What I'd like to really emphasize, and this is something I started thinking about in my early days at Caltech, is in biology, the question of how we deal with complexity is really absolutely paramount. And of course, biological complexity arises as a consequence of the random process and chaotic process to a certain extent of Darwinian evolution. So what it ends up doing is creating solutions to biological problems that are very much like Rube Goldberg machines. And the real question is, how do you decipher complexity of the ilk of a Rube Goldberg machine? And in fact, as you look at this device, so this is 14 separate gadgets that connected together allow Rube to cool his soup. And we can ask the very simple question, how do we solve this type of complexity? So number one, you need a complete parts list. You need to know all the elements that are present. Number two, what you'd ideally like to know is what each of those individual parts do. And this really is kind of biology for the last 40 years, looking at individual parts and everything. Number three, you have to know how they're interconnected. Number four, you have to know the dynamics of that interconnection. And finally, you have to understand how that motion leads to the cooling of the soup. That is the essence of systems biology, no more and no less. And I remember thinking early in my career about a book that really transformed my life in many ways, and I'm sure some of you have read Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And what it said was that paradigm changes fundamentally change how we think and practice science, but they're incredibly difficult to achieve. So I'd like to talk with you about my experience using innovation to approach complexity and how we've done three things. One, to fundamentally change scientific strategies for approaching biology and fundamentally change the biology culture. And we'll talk about it through a series of paradigm changes. Number two, I'm really committed to the idea that every scientist has an obligation to transfer their knowledge effectively to society. And number four, I'm convinced that complexity leads inevitably to the conclusion we have many big problems to attack, and big problems can't be done in isolation. They have to be partnerships, and I think national and international strategic partnerships are very much going to be the key to the future to solving hard problems in biology and in the other scientific disciplines as well. So over the last 40 years of my career, I have participated in a series of paradigm changes. So bringing engineering to biology, we developed 5 instruments, and these collectively led to what is called high-throughput biology. We'll explain that in a few minutes. Because of one of these instruments, the automated DNA sequencer, I was invited to the first meeting ever held on the Human Genome Project and became an advocate, inventing the enabling technology, the automated sequencer, became an advocate, spent the next 5 years trying to convince a very skeptical world this was a good project. A participant, I ran one of the 16 US human genome centers, and then, as you'll see, we're now applying this to medicine in a variety of ways. Developing the sequencer led to the realization that biology had to be fundamentally changed in that we had to integrate into it all of the different kinds of science. We had to make it a cross-disciplinary department. I tried to persuade Caltech to create the first cross-disciplinary department of biology, and everyone was in favor of this, but for the biologists, who I think were basically threatened. Bill Gates made it possible to start that department at the University of Washington, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. What was interesting is that department, in a sense, the first department of cross-disciplinary biology, led to the first Institute of Systems Biology. I resigned from the University of Washington in 2000, and I did so because the bureaucracy of a state university made it impossible to do many of the fundamental things that this new institute needed, and we'll talk about what some of those are in just a few moments. And then finally, systems approach to disease opened up the field of systems medicine and this thing I call P4 medicine, and that obviously is still in play. The instruments that we invented allowed us to automate the synthesis of sequencing and synthesis for DNA and proteins. And then somewhat later, we invented the inkjet technology, which we commercialized with a company I created, Rosetta, and then that was transferred more recently to Agilent. The first four instruments we developed were the foundation for creating the company called Applied Biosystems. And these 5 instruments led in really interesting ways to contemporary high-throughput biology. They automated chemistry, they integrated various aspects of the chemistry, and they introduced the concepts of parallelization and miniaturization that led to the high-throughput types of analyses and so forth. A friend of mine in the late 70s said, "Why don't you commercialize these instruments?" So I thought this sounded like an interesting idea. And I went to the president of Caltech, Murph Goldberger, then, and said, "It's been suggested I commercialize these instruments we're developing. What do you think about that?" And he gave me a long lecture on the role of an academic institution is scholarship and education. It is not commercialization. So I said, well, I looked at it in a very different way. My view is we all have an obligation to transfer knowledge that's relevant to society. And after 6 months, he finally gave up and said, okay, you can try. I went to 19 different instrument companies, and I was 0 for 19 at the end of a year and a half. Bill Bowes, a venture capitalist, called me and said, I hear you've been shopping these instruments around. I'll give you $2 million to start a company. And I went back to Murph Goldberger, and he said, venture capital money is dirty money. Harvard had been going through with Tom Matiotis and Mark Tashney, the Genetics Institute episode and so forth. But I wore him down, and just as we were about to sign the agreement for what became Applied Biosystems, I unfortunately gave a lecture to the Caltech trustees. And I say unfortunately, one, because Arnold Beckman was the chair of the trustees, and 2, because I'd gone to Beckman Instruments 3 different times, and the 3rd time his people said, don't come back, we're not interested. So Arnold heard this discussion of these 4 instruments and what they would do, and he came bounding up to me and said, this is incredible. This is exactly what Beckman needs. And I said, well, I didn't know that you were interested. And anyway, it was very complicated, and I won't go into the rest of the story, but I will say I learned 2 really important lessons. Number 1, if you have new ideas, set up a new organization to get them done. I would argue if any one of those 19 companies had said yes to my proposal, they would have done it in a half-hearted way, and they never would have recruited the talent we recruited to make Applied Biosystems a leading company in molecular instrumentation for many years. Number 2, if you have a good idea, don't go to middle-level people interested in profit and loss. Go to the very top. If I'd gone to Arnold, the very top at the beginning, he would have told Beckman to do it, but again, it would have been a mistake. So I'm a firm advocate, and new ideas need new organizational structures. We did go on to found or co-found 13 different companies, Amgen, Applied Biosystems, and many others. But I'll make two interesting points. One, we've done it in biology, in medicine, in computation, in mathematics, and in business. And two, of the 13 companies I've started, only one has failed, which is really a terrific record, I think mostly of luck, frankly, because, they turned out to be exactly what I wanted them to be. They transferred enormously important knowledge to society, and that's something I think we should be teaching our students. The Human Genome Project did two really important things. One, it democratized genes. It made all genes accessible to all biologists, all scientists. And two, it created the parts list that really enabled us to get systems biology going. And that was something that was really lacking. And that was something at the very beginning I found an enormously attractive idea about the Genome Project. The cross-disciplinary department that I created at the University of Washington brought together all the flavors of scientists you can see at the top there. And it was absolutely transformational. It pioneered two of the first key techniques in the field of proteomics, the analysis of proteins. It developed the software for the Human Genome Project, both how to assemble and how to validate the quality of sequences. It developed a new high-speed cell sorter. We developed there the inkjet technology, and it was home actually of not one, but two of the human genome centers. And of course, most important of all, it created the infrastructure for starting then the Institute of Systems Biology, which began in 2000. So this was to take a holistic, integrative view toward understanding biology. And one of the most important things we did was to create a systems-driven, cross-disciplinary platform that enables attacking big science problems, and I'll explain that in some detail. So the Institute is about systems science. It's about developing technologies and computational tools. It's about creating that systems-driven, cross-disciplinary platform, but it's also about transferring knowledge to society and strategic partnerships. And so let me say a word or two about a few of those things. A systems approach to disease requires two things: the generation of enormous amounts of data, for reasons we'll talk about, and then the translation of that data into a model we call the network of networks. So to give you an idea about the kind of data I see in medicine in the future, I see each of us being surrounded by a virtual data cloud of billions of data points and having the wherewithal to reduce that data to simple hypotheses about health and disease for each individual. The data is multiscalar. How we integrate it together and create these models is one of the grand challenges of systems medicine. And the really big grand challenge, which very few people in large data talk about, is the signal-to-noise issue. And I'll tell you, for technical reasons, simple machine learning is not going to solve the signal-to-noise problem, because in biology there are two types of noise: technical noise and biological noise. And to get rid of the biological noise, you need profound biology. And here's the network of networks. We have networks that operate at the level of the chromosome, at the level of molecules, at the level of cells, at the level of organs, and finally at the level of individuals. And when disease perturbs these networks, there is a reflection through all of these, and only by understanding the network of networks can we understand the consequence of the disease process. What about this systems-driven cross-disciplinary platform? And the important point to remember is this is an engine for two things: one, discovery, and two, innovation. So the basic mantra around which this whole framework is cast is the idea leading-edge biology mandates the development of pioneering new technologies to explore new dimensions of data space, and they in turn dictate the need for new analytic tools, computational and mathematical. And if you succeed in biology driving technology, driving computation, you have the chance to revolutionize biology. To make this work, you need a cross-disciplinary framework so those seamlessly can be integrated together. And the individuals in that cross-disciplinary framework absolutely have to follow two requirements. One, you need to learn the language of other disciplines to communicate effectively. And two, you need to learn to work together effectively in teams. And if you do that, you can discover new biological knowledge. But the really important point is that at each turn of this triumvirate cycle, you create intellectual property that is the source for the creation of new companies. And I'm going to talk about how successful ISB has been about that in just a few seconds. But let me make the last point about the proper platform for systems biology. And that is, you have to achieve a democratization of the tools for data generation and the tools for data analysis. And by democratization, I mean their accessibility to every scientist so they can drive their science with these powerful tools. And we can talk about how that is done. What I think is really unusual about ISB is we've created 3 institutions or centers for transferring knowledge to society. Number 1, the Center for Inquiry-Based Science is a group of 7 professionals that are committed to transforming science education, initially in Seattle, and now we're thinking about more broadly. And Dana Riley Black, the director, is here visiting with me in that regard. A second is a company I started about 7 years ago called The Accelerator, which is a company to create new companies, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And finally, we've created the P4 Medicine Institute, a 501c3 company whose fundamental job is to bring P4 medicine to patients. And again, Mauricio Flores, the executive director, is here visiting with us. So let's talk a little bit about transferring knowledge to company through the company creation. So ISB has spun off in the 12 years of our existence 5 companies. All of them have been extremely successful. One was the Accelerator, which is a partnership with 6 venture capital groups and an agreement to test new platforms, new ideas at a very early stage, and if they prove out, to convert them into companies. And with the Accelerator, we've created 12 additional companies. And what our view is that our equity participation in these companies is our endowment for the future. I think your president will testify to how hard it is to get technically oriented people to give endowment. It's a 3% return on your investment, and who's interested in that? So the bottom line is we've participated with 17 companies. We've actually raised now close to $500 million, half a billion dollars in investment, and we're creating close to 400 employees, mostly in Seattle, but spread out in some cases across the world. And this is for an institution that has 230 staff and 10 faculty members. So if you leverage innovation, you can be enormously and powerfully successful. Strategic partnerships. I think there are 3 overwhelming reasons for doing this. One, they let you take on really big, challenging scientific problems. 2, they allow you to gather the very best scientists to tackle these problems together. And 3, they allow you to think about entirely new strategies for fundraising for big science. Luxembourg, for example, is a strategic partnership we created about 3.5 years ago. This was a $100 million over 5-year investment on Luxembourg's part for us to do many things for them, But we use the money to invent the strategies and technologies for P4 medicine. It was enormously enabling, and we're exploring other strategic partnerships, and including one with Northeastern University. To give you an idea of a metric for our success, the Spanish Institute in 2009 developed new metrics for assessing the impact of papers and then integrating across 2,200 different research institutes the summed impact of all their papers. And in this analysis, ISB came out first in the US in the impact of the papers and third in the world. So it gives you an idea of how a new institute, again, was able to leverage its expertise in biology, in medicine, in technology, and computation and mathematics to achieve, I think, real success. And of course, the final paradigm change is systems medicine and P4 medicine. And systems medicine is really beginning an incredible transformation. It gives us fundamental insights into disease network mechanisms, and they're really key for diagnosis, therapy, and ultimately prevention. We can genome sequence families and identify genes, one, that cause disease, two, that facilitate wellness, and three, that actually are actionable gene variants where we can actually help patients by knowing that they have them. Systems medicine has turned blood into a window for health and disease by the ability to select biomarkers and get rid of the enormous amount of noise in most biomarker studies. And this has, again, allowed us to do disease diagnostics, the assessment of drug toxicity, and we're beginning to think about wellness markers as well. We can stratify disease into distinct subtypes. Breast cancer is 4 or 5 subtypes. That's important for the impedance match against therapy. Equally interesting, we can stratify patients. You as a patient may respond very differently to your next door neighbor to particular drugs, or you may have a genetic constitution that, if given a gene defect like Huntington's, will allow you to wait 70 years before it manifests itself, whereas your neighbor may manifest itself at 16. So it's that context of the population stratification of patients that is an essence of systems medicine and P4 medicine. We can look at how multi-organs respond to disease. We can take an entirely new approach to drug discovery by asking, are there combinations of drugs that can let us take a disease-perturbed network and make it behave in a more normal fashion? That isn't easy, but it will be done. And then, of course, we're beginning to really focus on developing techniques for facilitating wellness. Now, P4 medicine, transferring systems medicine to patients, is about 3 convergences. One is the digital revolution, handling big data. The second is systems medicine, which we've quickly summarized. And the third are patient-driven social networks. They are going to be the transformative force that will actually facilitate the exception of P4 medicine. Physicians are too conservative. Healthcare systems are too conservative. Insurance companies are too conservative. But patient-driven social networks will cause a revolution, and they're already beginning to do so in really interesting ways. So what about the 4 Ps? Predictive, my argument is in 10 years, you'll all have your genome sequences done, and from those, we'll be able to extract information on optimizing wellness and avoiding disease. My view is in 10 years, we'll have a little handheld device that'll prick your thumb, and we'll measure 2,500 proteins, 50 organ-specific proteins from each of your 50 major organ systems, and we'll follow longitudinally any transitions from wellness into disease across those organ systems. The prevention is about this new strategy for drug targets. It's about new ways to optimize the immune system to generate the cellular immunity we need to deal with AIDS. And most of all, it's about wellness, and I'll say more about that in just a moment. We're all genetically different from one another, so we have to be dealt with as individuals. And in fact, as we gather longitudinal data on each of us, the only qualified control is ourselves. So we'll be our own personal controls throughout our lifetime. And the participatory is the most difficult social aspect. How do we create the patient-driven social networks that will affect disease and wellness and be the driving force in P4 medicine? We're already starting to create them. Society is starting to create them, and they're beginning to be effective. We have to have access to patient data. We have a horribly convoluted system, IRBs, that put all sorts of constraints on patient data. The argument should be society has created the resources to enable the generation of this personal data, and society has the right to have access to that data to mine it for the predictive medicine of the future. So we're going to have to change some rules out there. The question of how we educate patients, physicians, and the healthcare community, I think, is fundamentally a fascinating IT question. And the whole question of how are we going to create an IT for this kind of healthcare system via P4 medicine? And I'll say the dimensionality of what all of the computer providers out there, the Microsofts, the Oracles, the IBMs, the Googles of the world, they're all thinking way, way too small. And wouldn't it be fascinating if we together could think about it in the right way? Now, P4 medicine differs from the classic evidence-based medicine in one, it's proactive. Two, it's focused on the individual. Three, it's focused on wellness. Four, it's focused on generating enormous amounts of data for the individual so we can sculpt the options for wellness and avoiding disease. Five, when you do population studies, you have to do them in the context of the fact each of us is a quantized unit of information, and you can't abstract our traits and make bell-shaped curves and say, if you're on the extremes, you're sick, because that makes no sense in a population that's highly polymorphic. So what we do is we look at each individual in the context of appropriate questions, and we aggregate subgroups of individuals that will respond to drugs, will respond to disease, will respond in unique ways that give us insights on how to deal with them. And of course, patient-driven social networks I've talked about. So really, P4 medicine is about wellness quantified, it's about disease demystified, and there are profound implications, I think, for P4 medicine. Most important is it's really going to turn around the sharply escalating costs of healthcare and lead potentially to our ability to export it to the developing world and a democratization of healthcare that would have been inconceivable even 4 or 5 years ago. Number two, helping this is the digitalization of medicine that's coming. We now see a revolution in digital instrumentation, 60, 70 gadgets out there that can measure your various parameters. It's led to an incredible set of social groups called the quantified self, but it's the beginning of the digitalization of medicine, and it's going to lead again to patient-driven medicine and wellness. It's going to cause every sector of the healthcare industry to rewrite their business plans over the next 10 years, and those that fail to do so won't be around to operate very long. And I would include, in my skeptical way, several major drug companies that I don't think have a clue about what's happening here. In fact, most don't at this period of time. Some are more adaptive than others. It'll transform the practice of medicine. We've seen many examples of that. But the other point is, I think for those countries, those groups that practice P4 medicine, it could be the source of significant wealth. I think the opportunity to recast the healthcare industry and create the new industries that will be responsive to the challenges and the opportunities is going to be paramount. But even more important is the idea that in 10 to 15 years, my prediction is there will be a wellness industry that will merge that will far exceed the healthcare industry, and its roots really will be pretty independent. And those obviously will be enormously interesting kinds of opportunities. So how are we going to turn around the sharply escalating costs? One, early diagnosis. We're really going to be able to avoid and/or ameliorate disease. I would say number two, being able to stratify disease and stratify patients is going to create the proper impedance match. To give you an example, Genentech found that about 20% of the breast cancer patients would respond beautifully to a drug called Herceptin, and they had a companion diagnostic that allowed them to identify those 20% of the patients. They went to the FDA with about 40 patients. They had a 95% cure rate. They got the drug approved on 40 patients. That is going to be the future of medicine, rather than 30,000 cancer patients where you just barely get the answer. This drug will let you live 2 months longer. And that's because you're looking at mixtures of patients, and the signal to noise is absolutely diluted. Re-engineering disease-perturbed networks with drugs, I've mentioned. The possibility of the benefits of wellness are going to be absolutely enormous. These digital technologies are going to drive down the costs of generating information for medicine. And nowhere is this more clearly seen than the Genome Project. And we can argue over the last 10 years or so, there's been a 10,000-fold decrease in the cost of genome sequencing. Really quite striking. And finally, there are a lot of other medical advances that I think are going to be enormously enabled by these systems approaches. And I would include stem cells, neurodegeneration, aging, vaccines, cancer. I think those are all things which in the next 10 years are going to lead to major opportunities. Two challenges for bringing P4 medicine to patients. One is our technical challenges, and the second are even more legion societal challenges, and the societal by far the more difficult. And our view of what we have to do to bring P4 medicine to patients is to create national and perhaps international strategic partnerships. And I'll show you two examples of those partnerships, one for the technical and one for the P4 medicine. So again, I've mentioned the state of Luxembourg and the 5-year agreement we have that's focused on developing tools and strategies for P4 medicine has been enormously enabling. And number two, we've created this P4 Medicine Institute, which together with ISB is creating now a network of clinical institutions that will explore pilot projects that will be proof of principles for P4 medicine. And we have two such clinical partners at this time, Ohio State Medical School and a community hospital called Peace Health, and we're talking with 5 or 6 others. So let me make some general comments to students and faculty and administrators about what I've learned in 40 years of thinking about these things. You know, I think we really have to fundamentally change in major ways how we teach. And as I think back about, and Caltech was a terrific place as an undergraduate, but I would sharply divide all the courses I took at Caltech into 2 categories. So there were conceptual courses that were fantastic. So I had physics from Feynman. He taught an absolutely incredible kind of course. I had a lot of lectures from Pauling. He was a wonderful conceptual thinker. The second category, and unfortunately these were the majority of the courses, were the vanity courses where the professor loved to tell you about the things that he knew a lot about, and you generally forgot about it within 2 or 3 months. So I would say if we stripped out the vanity courses and we focused on the conceptual courses, we could do interesting new things, like taking a systems view toward the disciplines. We need to make sure our students really have good training in the basics, physics, math, and chem. I'd say every undergraduate ought to be a dual major. I'd say, and you know, people say, well, it takes full time to teach computer science. But again, if you strip out the vanity courses, then you've freed up half your time and you can take the second course. I think teaching them to think analytically, we do a reasonable job there. Learning to use computational tools, thinking outside the box is really important. I'm going to say more about that in a moment. I think mini courses and online courses are a great way to expand your repertoire of knowledge without getting into enormous details. And I think we should be teaching the social implications of science. I think where American science has really failed is we haven't taken on the far right wing in articulating the power and compelling nature of science and evolution and all the things that they, and believe me, debating them is non-trivial because they are great debaters. I remember the time in Pasadena, we have a place called the Town Hall, which airs controversial issues. We had this poor evolutionist from the University of Washington go up against this pro from intelligent design. And the intelligent design guy destroyed the evolutionist. And at the end, the moderator said, "How many of you believed in evolution at the beginning of the lecture?" And 2/3 of the hands went up. And they said, and then she said, "How many have changed your mind on this?" 0 hands went up. So that says something about where we are. For students, I think cross-disciplinary training is absolutely critical. This business, I think, is really key. The guy is saying to his cat, never, ever think outside the box. And we say, always think outside the box. But the really interesting question is how you get people to think outside the box. And that, it's a great conversation to have. Okay, my view of the missions of an academic, and in part it came from that initial conversation with Murph Goldberger, is scholarship and education and transfer of knowledge to society. I think the other thing we should do is teach our students responsible community leadership because they can really make a difference locally. And this is my favorite advice to students. The typical career is a bell-shaped curve. You go up to a peak and you gradually fade away. What's really interesting is if near the peak you change your discipline, you induce insecurity, you get desperate to learn all the things and become an expert once again, and you start over. Well, suppose that you do this every 15 years of your career, then you never need to go down, for a long time anyway, on the bell-shaped curve. So my advice to students is get used to the idea that you're going to change and you're going to have to learn new things and there are going to be really exciting new kinds of opportunities. So let me close with 5 interesting lessons. One, what I learned from the paradigm changes is they really can fundamentally change how we think about biology and medicine. In each and every one of these cases, they were met with enormous skepticism. And finally, each new paradigm change required a new organizational structure to be created before it could be realized. Almost never can new ideas emerge from old organizations because the bureaucracies have been honed by the past and they're just barely capable of dealing with the future and not with the present and not at all capable of dealing with the future. Big science is an anathema to many biologists, and it's really wrong-headed thinking. Big science, in the sense of systems-driven, cross-disciplinary platforms, is really critical to solving complex problems. And in fact, the synergy between big and small science, a single investigator with their lab, can be absolutely enormous and facilitating. And in that context, I think we're going to see an enormously fascinating globalization of science in exactly the same way Friedman made the argument for education and communication. And again, the importance of that is this really exciting idea that you can take a big problem and you can say to yourself, who are the best people in the world to attack this with? And then you can persuade them and go out and raise the money to actually be able to do that. So let me return to the beginning of the lecture. The grand challenge of the 21st century, I would say for every scientific and engineering discipline, is in fact complexity. And I would argue biology perhaps is unique because it has these powerful systems-driven tools I've talked about for dealing with its complexity. And the reason this is so exciting is if you ask what are society's most pressing problems, technical problems, healthcare, global health, energy, the environment, agriculture, nutrition, on, they're all big problems that can be attacked in precisely the way I've outlined we've begun to attack healthcare. And so the real question is, how can institutions such as Northeastern University really be in a position to take advantage of these new opportunities? And I think the key is creating an environment where you have this systems-driven, cross-disciplinary platform and the skill, talent, and people to be able then to cluster and aggregate around appropriate kinds of problems. So the final point I would make is what's interesting about systems approaches is they can be ubiquitously applied to many, many different disciplines, scientific and non-scientific disciplines. And my final point is, and this is the Chinese symbol for the way, I think systems thinking is the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Let me start by asking you, incidentally, this is fascinating, and also, as you all know, our Seattle campus is going to be housed with the ISB, so we will have to work together on a daily basis, and we're excited about that. Let me start with a light question. In the next 15 years, what are the 5 next paradigmatic evolutions that you want to be associated with? You already mentioned what is currently happening. What are the next 5?
Next 5, well, that's a challenging question. So let me answer that technically, and then let me answer it socially, okay? I would say there are 2 important technical advances in biology that are going to be overwhelmingly important. The first is the ability to analyze at the single cell level all of the different types of information that we know and love, and to do it in a global sense. And this is not only powerful for giving us insights into the subtle components in a cancer or in a liver or these other kinds of things, but it also gives us the potential for putting together different cell types one-on-one and seeing how they facilitate changes in one another in ways we can understand. So I think single-cell analysis at the genome level and the proteome and metabolome and phenotype, all of these levels. I think the second challenge, and it's utterly critical to solving fundamental problems in the brain, is high-resolution detailed molecular imaging. Being able to follow molecular processes at the level of single cells in organs and see in vivo just how biology proceeds. So I'd say those are 2 technical advances that would be really terrific. I think a medical advance that I'd love to see is our ability to analyze the human genome enormously comprehensively to identify all of the actionable variants that will inform patients about how to optimize their cells, but to use the human genome in completely new ways that some may find objectionable. For example, I'm fascinated by the possibility that if we know the genomes of young people about to be married, we could scan those, we could identify those cases where they'd have double recessive deleterious genes. And what you could do for that couple is say, look, there are 1 or 2 sets of genes where you have 1/4 of a chance in your kids of having defective kids. So what we can do is in vitro fertilization. We can grow the fertilized egg up to the blastocyst stage. We can strip off 10 cells. We can sequence the genome, and we can say, here are the 75% of the fertilized eggs that are fine. You can use those. We'll keep the other ones. So that's one thing. I think another thing that we'll be able to do is we should sequence the genome of every newborn, and again, this will give us deep insights into developmental abnormalities that could be caught earlier. I don't know how many of you have friends that, with children of developmentally abnormal. It can be an absolutely life-changing experience in the family, and I think more and more we're going to be able to avoid those kinds of things. I think number 4, I'd really like to see that we've solved the education problem and the IT problem for P4 medicine, and we have this all in a seamlessly powerful fashion with educated populations and so forth, taking advantage of these revolutionary opportunities. And I would say, finally, I think the structure of science is really going to change in interesting ways, not all of which we fully understand with the globalization of science, these national and international strategic partnerships. And I think what's exciting about those is they give us the opportunity to bring the underdeveloped nations into access to science and giving them openings so that people can be trained and they can lift up their potential opportunities. I remember talking with Bill Gates about the fact what I'd really love to do in Africa is set up a terrific institute of systems medicine. You'd probably do it in South Africa because you need an infrastructure around which to begin the building. But I argued if you were willing to put in the money to do this, it could be transformational, not only in revolutionizing healthcare and how you do research, but I think in education and recruiting young people into science. So those are 5
I think I counted 6 because you put
6?
together education and IT.
Oh, okay.
And I wanted to ask you, Lee, you
okay.
mentioned that in terms of changing IT for healthcare, you said, look, when I look at Google and others, they are really off the mark. What did you mean by that?
Well, I had a slide which I was thinking of putting in, but I thought it would be too intimidating, that has about, I'd say, 11 or 12 different things I think IT for healthcare needs to be able to do, and only one of them is the digitalization of classic medical records. But some of the other things that I think are really important is, and I've said this to some of you, I think the amount physicians. Wouldn't it be great if a part of what we do in IT is we set up an absolute gold standard for conditions and the best of what you can do and how you should go about doing things? It would be incredibly useful for physicians too, who don't always tend to be up to date on things. I think the idea of being able to handle billions of data points for individual patients that are multidimensional, multi-scale in nature, that isn't even in the cards of the kind of things that people are thinking. And I think the need to be able to segregate effectively enormous amounts of longitudinal information for each individual patient. And then to have the analytic tools. I mean, what we'd like to be able to do is compare, in the US, 340 billion data sets of patients against one another to look for parameters that correlate with all sorts of different conditions and disease types. That's really how we're going to be inventing the medicine of the future. I mean, you know, we have the tools to begin thinking about how to do that, but it's several dimensions above what anyone out there is thinking. I think capturing the personal data that'll come from all the measurements made by the gadgets of the quantized self, your personal information, is going to be critical. I think collecting your social information, I think collecting your travel information, I think all of those things are going to be really relevant to fully analyzing the possibilities for the individual of medicine in the future. So those are some of the kind of examples. And clearly, you do these kind of one at a time, but wouldn't it be nice to put together a cohesive, integrated program that did the overall thing right, and then you could set up and see how you'd put these things together.
Thank you, Lee. I'm going to come back later and ask you another question, but I think that president of our student association is here, and he is going to read the first question that was submitted by via Twitter or the social media.
Yep, absolutely. So we have a question from Twitter, and I think you've alluded to this a little bit previously, but most primary care is provided in small practices. Where will the computing power data live in the time of personalized medicine?
Well, I think the computing power and the storage is going to live in the cloud. I think everything is going to be in the cloud, and the cloud will be available to you in Lincoln, Montana, accessible, infinitely available. We'll also not only put in the cloud the data, but we'll put in the cloud the analytic instruments we need to assess, analyze, compare the data, and those will be run by simple laptop computers and so forth. So, so that's my view of where things are going to go. That there are a lot of questions about security and there. I mean, one of the problems with the cloud right now is the bandwidth and getting tons and tons of data in, but we presume all of those problems are
up. And I'll give a premium also to the students who want to ask a question too. Yes, Peter.
Sounds
Mr.
good.
President.
So one other question from Facebook this time. In all the years of you helping children understand science, what has been the best question a child has ever asked you?
Oh my goodness, that's well, you know, I think one of the deepest and most interesting questions that I've been asked is, why should I go into science? Mm-hmm. And I mean, and that's a hard question to answer because the answer is an enormous. I think it's really an important question for us to ask, namely, why should one want to go into science or medicine or anything? I mean, what is the reason? And you know, the first thing I always say when people ask me questions like that is, you should always have passion and enthusiasm for what you're going to do. That is a really critical question because only then can you kind of express your full kind of potential. So part of the answer to the question is to look into yourself and say, you know, is this something you think you would really like? And with lots of kids, they don't really know essentially enough to kind of answer that question. And then you can go on and talk about what science is like, and you can always talk about your personal experiences of how you got started in science and what excited you and why you made a choice of biology over geology. Those are my two career choices, and so forth. So I think that was one of the I think questions of that type are really interesting.
Let's, who would like to? Yes, Kim and, both.
Could you please elaborate on
Wait.
Yeah, you have to speak into the mic.
Could you please elaborate on wellness? How do you see us improving it?
Give it to your neighbor, I think. Yeah, thank you.
So that's a great question. So, I mean, first of all, we can ask the question, what is wellness exactly? And I think we have to confess that we don't have a very precise answer for that. It's kind of a psychological state. But my idea about wellness is that by comparing people who are said to be in a state of wellness with those that aren't, you can get metrics for the assessment of wellness, okay? And I would say there are a whole series of different metrics that you can get. For example, there are real suggestions that there are metrics for measuring physiologic age as opposed to chronologic age, okay? And I can tell you some of the experiments that have been done. And we're trying to get a blood test that can do that kind of thing. And so it's an assessment for wellness. Suppose you're 70 years old and your psychological age is 50. You're in great shape, right? Now, if the inverse is true, you're pretty bad off. So that is one kind of assessment that you could think about. But we're setting up some really interesting systems experiments with Procter & Gamble on the quality of the skin. And I think the quality of the skin is going to be a real index of overall wellness and things like that. So anyway, so we're trying to find parameters that we can use to gauge wellness. And we're also at the genetic level trying to find parameters that we can use to gauge wellness. And one of the experiments that we're doing now is we've sequenced the genomes of 18 people that are 115 or older. And what we're doing is asking, are there genes in this individual that have segregated that are different from the average population out there? And then we'd like to do validation studies on another 18 or 20, 115 or older patients to see if we come up again with the same sets. So those are the kinds of things we're thinking about.
So we have many, I see many hands. I'm going to remind you to keep your questions very short. Go ahead, Rich.
So one of the things the Human Genome Project did was to provide a platform for epigenomic analysis.
Right.
That is the addition of groups that regulate the expression of genes. And I suspect myself that mode of regulation will prove to be related to diseases in a way beyond what let's say either single nucleotide polymorphism, genetic variants, or mutations do, especially because it's so plastic and so environmentally sensitive. Mm-hmm. Is the IS being involved in epigenomic discoveries as a platform, an information platform for analyzing wellness and disease?
So let me just say that epigenetic marks, there is one group that has looked at those and they have some validation for wellness metrics for being able to use that. I do agree with you. I think epigenetics is incredibly important. What's really interesting to understand is epigenetics is important for physiologic processes, and I call disease a physiologic process. I think epigenetics is a lot less important for development because there you want to hardwire the circuitry so you get the same kind of individuals every time. And Eric Davidson has done some absolutely pioneering classic work on development in the sea urchin, and he's shown you can explain 100% of the complexity of development in the first 10 days by hardwired genome circuitry and things like that. But I think for physiology and I think for disease, epigenetics will be very important, yeah.
We have Sri. Oh my God, we have Sri, we have Misha. So I don't know whether we're going to be able to answer all the questions tonight, but
I can give shorter answers. So
no,
maybe
no,
I
no,
should
no.
do
We
that.
want you. We're here to listen to you. So Misha, can you be also very short after Sri?
So the current paradigm of what you call evidence-based medicine is to take clinical trials with large numbers and try to then use that data for the individual. It seems to me what you're implying is P4 medicine is going to essentially, when you use P4 medicine, the clinical trial is going to be N equals 1, so to say, because you're starting with the individual. Trying to get the whole system to start thinking in this way requires a real paradigm change. And if you have any thoughts on that, I'd like to hear.
Well, look, so you're right, and I love N equals 1 experiments. I think they can be terribly informative. The question is how you can aggregate them so you can get greater statistical power, but that is another question. I think the way that will force society and the medical community to accept N of 1 type experiments is through success. Look, I think the only way paradigm changes ever get accepted, frankly, is you have to show you can do something no one could ever do before. And it isn't enough to go out and, I could, in '86, I could give essentially every reason, I could give most reasons I thought the Genome Project was a great project then. But people hear what they want to hear, and they couldn't hear any of those arguments. Now they can hear them because they've seen that they actually happen. So that's why the pilot projects in the P4 arena are so terribly important, showing that we can take things like neuropsychiatric diseases, we can take things like preterm birth, we can take things like cancer, and this is already starting to be demonstrated, or we can take things like wellness, and we can show that you can do two important things. You can improve patients' health, you can reduce the cost of healthcare. And that's kind of the mission we have in P4 medicine.
Misha, and then we'll move it back. Do you still want to ask? We'll move it back here so we keep the balance. Yes, Misha, very short.
Yeah.
I know it's difficult for you, Misha.
All right. Last time I spoke with Lee in Moscow, Ritz-Carlton. So my question is take us 40 years back, when you were in the middle of discovery what turned out to be the most beautiful intellectual paradox about diversity of antibody, for which you got Nobel Prize, Lasker Prize together with Tanigawa. And actually, it is still the most striking example how a small number of genes can do it. What prompted you on the top of that fame and accomplishment to change direction? This would be of interest to students here.
Absolutely. That's a great, yeah.
I'll tell you, it was a conversation with Max Delbruck, who is a Nobel Prize winning biologist who was in the lab next door at Caltech. And in the midst of all this wonderful success we were having with discovering mechanisms of antibody diversity, Max said, immunology is really complicated, and you really haven't done very much toward understanding the deeper issues of immunology. And I said, what do you mean? We've done these gene studies. We've shown there are 2 genes and 1 polypeptide chain, and we've shown the mutational mechanism of all these things. And he said, those are epiphenomena. He said, the big questions in immunology are the immune response, our tolerance, and our autoimmunity. And he said, we don't understand anything about those things. And he was utterly right. And I mean, I really got to thinking about it. And that's why I actually started doing other things in immunology that were moving toward the systems approach, because Max at that time had gotten started in his 3rd or 4th career. He was trying to study phycomyces from a systems point of view, but he just didn't have the systems in the late 70s, early 80s, didn't have the tools to be able to do it. But that conversation made me think more and more about immunology and what was important. And so now we're starting to go back to immunology because we can actually do really definitive things in these areas now. So it's so that was what prompted. I realized that we'd just done an epiphenomena. Now I wanted to move on to the main phenomena. So,
And then we have also, do we have 2 students here that raised their hands? My God, we have 3. So we'll have to combine. What I'm going to suggest, since Lee is going to bring all the answers together, after you answer, maybe you can ask the 3 questions you have, and Lee can provide an answer to your question and to the 3 combined. Go ahead.
My question is to enable you to realize your vision of democratization and globalization of your people medicine. Are you or your institute working on new technologies that are not prohibitive to most people to do that type of
Cost.
cost-wise? And would you be interested in a technology that can answer that, solve that problem?
I could never
Please,
say no to that offer.
Let's move it. Yeah, who can say no to something that is inexpensive? We'll all take it.
But again, with the digitalization of medicine, the cost of the data and measurements and stuff is really going to go down to nothing.
So raise your hands over there. We have one. Yes. So please go ahead.
Hi. So I work at Mass General's emergency department. So one of the issues that we face all the time and is one of the things that I think is probably the biggest issue, and I'm just curious if you've thought about this. How do you get patients to be personally responsible for medicine and take that responsibility and do it themselves in that kind of an era and have that ability to do those things on their own?
What a terrific question. So
let's.
And then along with those lines is when you start to think about these things and you're thinking about the different topics you've brought up today, and you're a student and you're graduating soon, who should you align yourself with in these industries that can help formulate a career that can take you to be a part of these innovative paradigms?
Okay. Here, one more. We have one hand over there. Yeah.
As companies become more invested in sequencing the genomes and discovering therapeutic genes, are we running any risk of them claiming intellectual property rights over this information that'll prevent the democratization of these tools that you said is so necessary for P4 medicine to succeed?
Okay, do I?
Yes.
I have to remember all those questions.
Yeah.
So with regard to the last question on intellectual property, I think the answer is no, and I think it is no because medicine more and more is going to be a property of systems and not a property of individual entities. And that's number one. And I think number two, there is an emerging belief that individual elements of nature should not be patentable. Now that's mixed blessings in my point of view, but the courts are pushing very strongly in that process, and it's going to be interesting to see how the Supreme Court rules on the myriad genetic engineering case. I remember going about 10 years ago now, twice to the patent office trying to explain systems biology in the kind of patents, systems patents that would be coming in the future. And man, there wasn't even a glimmer of recognition in their eyes about what in the world I was talking about. So it is going to be hard to get these to educate the patent office so they can deal with the kind of opportunities that are coming in the future. And look, everything in diagnostics is going to be multi-parameter. So the really interesting question is how you can get multi-parameter patents that will really protect you if there are a lot of other elements over here from which you might draw to do the same kind of thing. So, but those are interesting questions. Where would you go to provide the kind of training and vision you need to? I would say, rather than going to a company, you should go to some of those academic institutions that are forward-looking and have taken these systems approaches to biology and science and gain your education there. I think they're almost no companies that you could get really a broad, comprehensive view of systems thinking and so forth. And with regard to patient responsibility, the key is A, education. The patient has to have enough information, and B, with that education, making the patient realize it is to their benefit to comply. And again, I think a great example is this social network, series of networks called the Quantified Self that Wired magazine started in 2007. They're actually all over the US now. And these are individuals who have these various gadgets that can make personal measurements about sleep, about all sorts of different things. And they're doing crowdsourcing. They're working together to optimize how they can manage their wellness and so forth. And these are incredibly motivated people that are forcing their physicians to change and learn things in interesting ways. So I think the key to responsible patient behavior is education. So we have to figure out how to do that.
You have the last question over there.
So it's great to hear the signal to noise, how to figure out. And now we produce enormous data. Seems like this noise will be multiplied enormous. I saw that you think from all this swarming of data, trying to figure out what's a simple model. It can do the other way around, get a simple model, think about a single model first, then grab the information second.
Well, you know, the groups that have tried to do top-down biology, that is, they have a vision of how something works, and they do the math or the computation, it has failed universally. There was an institute that got started about the time we started our institute in Japan that was doing this top-down computational mathematical analysis, and it failed totally 5 years later. You know, they said proudly that within 5 years they'd have a complete mathematical description of E. coli, and of course they never even came close to that. So I think the key to getting models that explain the complexity of biology is starting with the data itself. And then you have the responsibility, as I've said. There are two types of noise. One is the technical noise that arises from the nature of the measurements themselves. And there you can use machine learning and lots of other things to statistics to deal with that. But the other is this biological noise, which is much harder to deal with. And by that, I mean if you make a measurement of an aspect of phenotype in an organism, often there are many different biologies that contribute to that phenotype. And if you're only interested in one of them, say neurodegeneration, you have to figure out how to subtract all the other ones away. Because if you do machine learning, they aren't noise. They're real, but they aren't the real signal that you want. So you have to have domain expertise, and you have to think in really clever ways about how you can subtract biological noise as well as how you get rid of technical noise. But as I look at these big data discussions, there isn't ever very good discussion. I think the signal to noise is intrinsic to all big data, and I think it's going to turn out to be much more severe than people have thought about to date.
Let me mention as a closing remark, Lee, would you, during our discussion, you mentioned some parallelism and complementarity between the work that the network group here is doing and how you approach systems. Would you elaborate on that and share it with the audience?
Well, your network group is enormously diverse, and I'm sure I've only heard a little bit, but some of the things that I think are really essential to being able to deal with is in this network of networks that I've shown you. Can we begin to create models that will predict the consequence of perturbations at various levels? And I think in the groups that you have here that do the theoretical modeling of networks, I think that's really, really going to be interesting. You've got networks that are interested in social phenomena or interested in mining the data of our everyday lives to make inferences. You know, Amazon uses it to figure out how to sell us things. We'd love, with you, to be able to use it to figure out how to optimize wellness, how to minimize disease and things like that. I mean, one of the enormous challenges in medicine as we move forward is how do you explain things to the patients? And one of the group here is creating avatars that actually can explain how you check out of a hospital, can begin to explain common phenomena in a way, and actually check to make sure that the patient really understands the communication, everything. I think this is a terrific vehicle. You know, one of the enormous problems we're going to have is when you all get your genomes done, who's going to explain to you the enormous, fascinating amount of information that's there? Could we have avatars that could kind of logically take you? I mean, there are high-level things you'll want to know, and then there are low-level things that you could know if you wish. And being able to take people through those in a logical way. And it isn't going to be physicians. In some sense, genetic counselors could, but I think their knowledge is way too limited for what we're going to need to do. So we may need avatars to help us into this new world of information and healthcare.
Lee, thank you very much. I see some hands. Let me mention that we're going to have a reception, and during the reception, you'll have a priority, but make sure you give Lee a drink.
Before I answer any more questions.
Thank you very much, Lee.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Yes.
much. Thank you. Thank you.